Germany and Japan both lost World War II. Both surrendered completely and were occupied by foreign armies. In 1945, they stood in the same position, defeated, exposed, and unable to decide their own future. What followed was supposed to expose the crimes and make those responsible pay for them. In Germany, that largely happened. In Japan, it didn't. That difference shaped what each country would remember and what it would not. And here's what's strange. The difference was never announced or compared. No moment where someone said, "We're going to handle Japan differently." It just happened. Quietly. In conference rooms. In filing cabinets. That difference didn't happen by accident. The result was two countries that lost the same war, committed crimes on the same scale, and ended up with completely different relationships to their past. One was made to remember, the other was allowed to forget. This video is about how that happened. Let's start with what Japan does remember. The war, in Japanese public memory, is defined by two dates more than any others: August 6th and August 9th, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Roughly 200,000 people lost their lives. These casualties became the emotional center of Japan's memory of the war. Hold that number in your head, 200,000, and step outside Japan. In China alone, historians estimate between 10 and 14 million civilian casualties. Not soldiers, civilians. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of Belgium or Portugal. Gone. In Indonesia, Japanese occupation policies caused a famine that killed between 2 and 4 million people. This wasn't a natural disaster. The military seized rice for their own needs, banned food transport between districts, and forced farmers to grow jute and other industrial crops instead of food. Japanese students visit Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. They see artifacts preserved from that day: a child's lunchbox, melted glass, a watch stopped at 8:15 A. They learn a word that exists almost nowhere else in the world: hibakusha, the bomb-affected people. Every year, ceremonies pause the country at the exact moment the bomb fell. Bells ring, heads bow, politicians speak. The whole world is invited to witness Japan's suffering. This is powerful. This is real. These civilians deserve to be remembered. Now, back to other Asian countries. In Nanjing, China, more than 200,000 civilians were killed in a matter of weeks, December 1937 to early February 1938. Same scale as Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Without a bomb. Just soldiers, given permission to do whatever they wanted in a captured city. The events of those 6 weeks are extensively documented. Foreign businessmen and missionaries who stayed behind kept diaries. They wrote letters. They took photographs. John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member, organized a safety zone that saved an estimated 200,000 lives. Even he was deeply disturbed by what he witnessed. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal later called it one of the worst incidents in modern warfare. But here's the thing. If you stopped someone on the street in London or New York or Sydney and asked, "What happened in Nanjing?" how many would know? Quick thing before we continue. If you're enjoying this, a like genuinely helps. Alright, back to the story. In Indonesia, recent scholarship has tried to reconstruct what happened. A study published in 2024 in the journal Economic History Review estimated 1.8 million excess casualties in Java alone during 1944 to 1945. The Indonesian government's initial estimate was 4 million. Either way, we're talking about losses on a scale that would dominate any country's historical memory. In Indonesia, it's barely discussed. In the Philippines, more than 1 million civilians lost their lives during the occupation. When Japanese forces retreated from Manila in February 1945, they left an estimated 100,000 civilians dead in a single month. An entire city devastated. In Vietnam, Japanese seizure of rice contributed to the 1945 famine. Estimates range from 1 to 2 million casualties. Ho Chi Minh referenced this famine in Vietnam's Declaration of Independence just months later. For Vietnam, it was a defining trauma. Internationally, almost unknown. Across Burma and Thailand, over 90,000 Asian labourers lost their lives building the Burma Railway. You might know it from the movie Bridge on the River Kwai, but that film focused on British prisoners of war. The Asian workers, Malays, Tamils, Burmese, Javanese, were the majority of the workforce, and they died at higher rates. Over 40% never came home. These casualties happened over years, village by village. 200,000 became a global symbol of loss. Tens of millions became a footnote. So why? Why does the whole world know about Hiroshima, but not Nanjing? Not the Indonesian famine? Not the Burma Railway? Not Vietnam? This is actually the question at the center of the story. People might think, well, the atomic bomb was new. It was dramatic. It was the first time nuclear weapons were used on civilian populations. It ended the war. All true, but that's not the whole answer. Germany also suffered massive Allied bombing. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, hundreds of thousands of German civilians lost their lives in air raids. If any country had a reason to center its war memory on what happened to it rather than what it did, Germany had that reason. But that's not what happened. Germany's central memory of the war is not Dresden. It's Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, the camps, the Holocaust. Germany built its entire post-war identity around acknowledging what it did, not mourning what happened to it. And this wasn't just rhetoric. It was policy. It was education. It was architecture. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe sits in the center of Berlin, a 5-minute walk from the Brandenburg Gate. It covers an entire city block, 2,711 concrete slabs. You can't visit Berlin and miss it. That's the point. German school children are required to learn about the Holocaust. Many visit concentration camp sites. The crimes are not allowed to fade into ancient history. Politicians reference them. Museums center them. When German Chancellor Willy Brandt visited the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial in 1970, he spontaneously dropped to his knees. The photograph went around the world. He never explained it. He didn't need to. Japan's memorials tell a different story. The loudest ones are about Japanese suffering. The Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima draws 1.5 million visitors a year. The Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum is a major tourist destination. These are powerful, important places, but there's no equivalent in Japan for what Japan did. No central memorial in Tokyo that forces visitors to confront the invasion of China, the occupation of Southeast Asia, the millions who died. The crimes exist in textbooks, sometimes, but they don't stop the country. They don't get bells. They don't get ceremonies broadcast around the world. That difference didn't happen by accident. Here's where it gets interesting. Wars don't run on soldiers alone. They run on factories. In Germany, companies like Krupp, Siemens, and Volkswagen used forced labor during the war. After surrender, those links were exposed. Executives were interrogated. Some were tried at Nuremberg. But the full reckoning took decades. It wasn't until the late 1990s that international pressure, including class action lawsuits in American courts, finally forced action. In 2000, the German government and German industry created a compensation fund. Over 6,500 companies contributed. The total, 5.2 billion euros. By 2007, more than 1.66 million survivors in nearly 100 countries had received payments. The amounts were small, between 2,500 and 7,500 euros. Symbolic, not compensatory. But the door stayed open. Now look at Japan. Same situation. Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Nissan. These companies powered the empire. They used forced labor at massive scale. Koreans, Chinese civilians, Allied prisoners. After surrender, American occupation authorities announced plans to break up 325 major Japanese companies. Guess how many were actually dissolved? 11. The rest were reorganized, renamed, and returned to business. Within a decade, the same corporate groups dominated Japan's economic miracle. No international trials for executives. No compensation fund. Survivors sued decades later. Korean forced laborers, Chinese civilians. The cases went to court. Most were dismissed. Too much time had passed, the courts said. Statutes of limitations, treaties, legal technicalities. The factories outlived the people who built them. Defeat usually breaks governments. In Germany, anyone associated with the Nazi system was marked. Former officials were removed. Careers ended. Public service carried suspicion for decades. Japan started the same way. In the early occupation, tens of thousands of officials were purged. Then something changed. The policy reversed. Quietly, thousands were depurged, allowed back into government. They returned to the same ministries, the same planning offices, the same desks. Men who had signed wartime orders now signed reconstruction budgets. The uniforms were gone, the authority remained. Why the reversal? The Cold War? By 1947, American priorities had shifted. Japan was no longer just a defeated enemy. It was becoming a strategic ally, a bulwark against communism in Asia. Stability mattered more than accountability. Continuity mattered more than justice. Let's talk about scientists, and this is where the story gets strangest. In Manchuria, the Japanese military ran a facility called Unit 731. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Sounds boring, right? That was intentional. Its actual purpose was biological weapons research, and the researchers there conducted experiments on human subjects. Thousands of people, mostly Chinese civilians, but also Koreans, Russians, and some Allied prisoners, were used as test subjects. I'm not going to describe what happened inside that facility. The information is publicly available if you want it. What I want to focus on is what happened after the war, because this is where the story takes a turn that sounds almost unbelievable. The scientists who ran Unit 731 were never tried for war crimes. They were granted immunity by the United States. Here's how it worked. After Japan surrendered, American intelligence officers learned about the biological weapons program. They realized the Japanese had conducted research that American scientists had never been able to do. For ethical reasons, they wanted the data. The scientists, led by a man named Shiro Ishii, offered a deal. Hand over all the research findings, and in exchange, immunity from prosecution. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied powers in Japan, approved the deal. The research data was shipped to Fort Detrick in Maryland, the center of America's own biological weapons program. The Japanese scientists went home. They were told to stay quiet about what they'd done. Most did, and then they had careers, prominent careers. Some became university professors, some ran hospitals, some joined pharmaceutical companies. One became governor of Tokyo, another became president of the Japan Medical Association, the leading professional organization for doctors in Japan. Years later, American investigators concluded that most of the research data had actually been useless. The experiments were too poorly controlled, the conditions too variable to produce reliable scientific results. But by then, the immunity had been granted. The deal was done. The Soviets held their own trial, the Khabarovsk war crimes trial in 1949, where 12 Japanese officers were convicted for biological warfare. But in the West, this was dismissed as communist propaganda. In 1981, Bert Roling, a Dutch judge who had served on the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, learned the full story of Unit 731 and the American immunity deal. "It is a bitter experience," he wrote, "to be informed now that centrally ordered Japanese war criminality of the most disgusting kind was kept secret from the court by the US government. The victims of Unit 731 were never named in any international mouse, tribunal. Their families received no acknowledgement, no explanation, no justice. They just disappeared from history." There is a part most people miss: the paperwork. After 1945, Japan didn't control its courts, its media, or its economy. One country did: the United States. MacArthur ruled Japan with more authority than the emperor ever had. His occupation government controlled what could be printed, broadcast, and taught. His decisions shaped what Japan would remember. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal tried some leaders. Hideki Tojo was executed, along with 6 others. But the scope was narrow. Crimes against Asian civilians received far less attention than crimes against Western prisoners of war. The emperor was never indicted. Immunity was granted to Unit 731. Files were sealed. Corporate breakups were cancelled. Officials were depurged. None of this required speeches. It required signatures. Each signature narrowed what could be prosecuted. Each classified file removed something from the historical record. Each decision pushed certain victims further into silence. The Cold War was beginning. Japan was being repositioned. Some doors opened. Others were locked from the inside. Here's a detail that matters more than it seems: the law. In Germany, murder has no statute of limitations. In 1979, West Germany specifically abolished time limits on Nazi-era killings. That meant investigations could continue indefinitely. Prosecutions happened into the 2000s. Old age was not a defense. In Japan, time worked differently. Some crimes were excluded from prosecution by treaty. Others expired under domestic law. When survivors sued Japanese corporations decades later, the most common defense was simple. Too much time had passed. Time became the defense. Germany proves another path was possible. Not clean, not painless, but different. Where crime stayed central to national memory. Where corporations eventually paid, however late, however inadequate. Where time was not allowed to erase murder. The contrast matters because it shows this wasn't fate. It was choice. Choices made by specific people. In offices, with stamps and pens. That choice shapes the present. It explains why survivors in Korea still protest outside the Japanese embassy every Wednesday. They've been doing it since 1992. Over 1,600 protests. It explains why Chinese citizens still demand acknowledgment of Nanjing. Why the phrase comfort women, itself a euphemism, remains politically contested. It explains why, in 2015, Japan and South Korea announced a final and irreversible agreement on wartime issues, and why survivors rejected it. They hadn't been consulted. They didn't want a settlement. They wanted an official acknowledgement, written into the record. They're still waiting. It explains why every August, the anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki dominate Japanese media, while the anniversaries of Nanjing and Manila pass quietly. In 2012, the USC Showa Foundation, the same organization that preserves Holocaust testimonies, partnered with the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall to record survivor stories. By then, the average interviewee was 85 years old. The oldest was 94. They had waited their entire adult lives to be asked. Most died within a few years of telling their stories. In 2017, one of the last known survivors from the Burma Railway's Asian labourers died in Singapore. His name was Qosman Hassan. For 70 years, he hadn't talked about what he experienced. He only started speaking in his final years. He wanted his grandchildren to know. He wanted someone to remember. Somewhere today, an elderly woman who survived the occupation of Southeast Asia is still alive. She watched family members disappear and never learned what happened to them. There is no document. There is no grave marker. There is only an absence. She has never heard an apology. She probably never will. The past was not erased, it was sorted. Some crimes were documented, prosecuted, and entered into the historical record. Others were sealed in classified files. Some victims were named, memorialized, and given ceremonies. Others waited, aged, and died without any official acknowledgement of what happened to them. Germany was made to carry its crimes in public. The weight of that history is visible in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Munich, in memorials, museums, and educational requirements that ensure every generation knows what happened. Japan was allowed to carry its crimes quietly, not erased. That would be too simple. Available in archives, discussed in academic papers, taught in some classrooms, but not central, not unavoidable. Not something that stops the country once a year and forces it to remember. Both paths were shaped by decisions made in the years after 1945, by specific people, in specific offices, signing specific documents. Americans who decided that strategic interests mattered more than complete accountability. Japanese officials who were happy to rebuild without a full reckoning. And victims across Asia who waited for trials that never came. Once you see how memory was constructed, what was placed in the center and what was pushed to the margins, the difference becomes hard to unsee. And that's the real story of this video. Not just what happened during the war, but what happened after. Who decided what would be remembered? Who decided what could be forgotten? And who, 80 years later, is still waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened to their families? Because somewhere today, in Korea, in China, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, there are people who lived through the war, or whose parents did, who are still waiting. Not for money, not even for punishment, just for someone to say, "This happened. It mattered. You are not forgotten." They're still waiting.